touched on it, gender and
Mhm.
anxiety. Are you finding any differences in how men and women cope?
And little increment where the worries actually make us feel better because we get this hit of dopamine. We used to revere females in our society. Now, if you're in a victim mentality, you'll never get out of anxiety and
People are
alarm.
self-medicating for anxiety with
Oh,
alcohol.
absolutely. I think addiction is basically self medication for anxiety. Was when I started focusing on my body, because I went through this phase where I was so desperate, I was suicidal.
Why does anxiety matter so much to you, Dr. Kennedy? Why is it personal?
Well, because I suffered from the damn condition for like 50 years. And traditional therapies weren't helping me. I think traditional therapy is really, excuse me, all about trying to fix the worries of your mind, assuming that the worries of your mind are actually the root cause of anxiety, which I don't actually believe. I mean, to shorten this up really quickly, I had anxiety for many, many years. I grew up with a dad who was schizophrenic and bipolar and went through all sorts of different therapies. And then the only thing that really seemed to make a difference was when I started focusing on my body, because I went through this phase where I was so desperate, I was suicidal. So I did LSD. And on LSD, it showed me that my anxiety was actually this energy that was stuck around my solar plexus area. And it really had nothing to do with the thoughts of my mind. That energy would poke at the thoughts of my mind and create the thoughts of my mind. And I've come up with a theory of anxiety that it's really this sense of alarm, this old unresolved alarm from our old childhood wounds that weren't really solved by our parents or caregivers that stayed as an energy inside of our body. And through this process called interoception, where the mind is always reading the body, if the mind reads that there's all this old alarm in there, it's going to make up thoughts and worries and warnings and what ifs and worst case scenarios that are completely consistent as a reflection of that old traumatic alarm that's still held in your body. So it's more the state of alarm that's held in our body than it's actually the worries of our mind. Now, the worries of our mind, of course, play a massive role in anxiety, but they're more of a symptom than they are a cause. And we can certainly talk about that.
Yeah, you talk about the alarm piece quite a lot, the alarm in the body, and as you said yourself, it's the solar plexus. The abdominal area, the digestive area, is often considered is spoken about as the second brain,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it really resonated with me when you mentioned that because I mean I think most people would probably understand what you're talking about, that physical
Yeah.
kind of strange thing that happens in your solar plexus. Um, do you know if there's any science? What kind of science? What kind of research is done looking at that? That
Well, it's
that.
hard, Connor. It's really hard because it's almost a spiritual effect, right?
Mm,
So now I feel my alarm in my solar plexus. A lot of people feel it in their throat. A lot of people feel it in their belly. A lot of people feel it around their heart. What I usually find as a general rule is it's close to the midline of the body, and it's usually in the torso somewhere. Now, I have seen people say they feel it in their forehead. I've had people say they feel it in their knees. But in general, when I sort of start zeroing in on people's alarm, I'll usually find it in the midline of the body, usually around the heart area, solar plexus, throat, that kind of stuff. And it's usually a pressure or a pain or something that people can describe as being different. And they haven't really thought to look at it before because they've been so distracted and sidetracked by their worries. They really haven't looked down into their body to find this energy of alarm. And if you don't see it, there's nothing you can do about it. And a lot of people just get caught up in their worries forever and never actually see that the underlying root cause of what they call anxiety is really the state of alarm that's been stored in their body. Now, that said, we can't separate the mind from the body. It's sort of an academic distinction. And it may not be that trauma is stored in the body after all. It may be that trauma is stored in the brain's representation of the body, which is really kind of the same thing. We're getting into sort of a semantic thing, but it's really the sensation in the body that we can focus on and change as the root cause of what's driving our anxious mind. So we have to find that root cause. And for me, it's in my solar plexus, like you said. For other people, it's in different parts of their body. But I train people to look at specifically when we get worried, when you start fixating on your worries and ruminating, go into your body and see if there's an area that kind of lights up that feels like a pressure or pain or hot or cold or whatever. And that is probably the place of alarm that we have to focus on.
In your story, there was a particular incident that is quite shocking, quite moving in relation to your father when he passed, and
Mm.
discovering that.
His
And there's a
body.
direct line that you
Yeah.
draw back into your childhood. For many people, it may not, and which is clearly it's identifiable immediately. I mean, anybody reading Anxiety or X, your book was, oh my
Hmm.
God, that's going to do it, right? Um, but for many people, they may not be able to identify the particular moment in their lives.
Absolutely.
What would your perspective be there? Like it requires a lot of therapeutic digging work, do you think?
Well, maybe yes and no. I think just making the intention to look in your body for an energy that you have been sort of avoiding in a way because you've been so wrapped up in the worries of your mind, you haven't even really looked to think there. Some people can find it very easily and very quickly. But by the same token, there is this sort of unconscious resistance to finding this alarm because when we do, we open up this Pandora's box of trauma, of pain from our childhood. And as you say, many people won't know what it was. Now, I found my father's, suicide dead body when I was 26. The damage had really been done since I've been 10 years old when my dad would go into like bipolar fits or like depression, mania, psychosis. I would say that my trauma was much more due to the chronic nature of not knowing what my father was going to do. And he was never abusive or violent, but not to just his inconsistency. I say the trauma was much more to do with that ill-defined uncertainty of what he was going to do rather than that specific event of finding his dead body.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Um, uncertainty would it be related to being blindsided?
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of people adopt worry because in a way they believe that the worries are making the uncertain a little more certain. So when you worry about something, if you're worried that, some medical test is going to be like a horrible cancer or something like that, and then you convince yourself of that before the fact, on some level you're minimizing uncertainty, but you're robbing Peter to pay Paul because when you believe you have cancer, that's alarming. So, but I do think in our brains there's kind of like a point 0.4 second little increment where the worries actually make us feel better because we get this hit of dopamine. And dopamine is this sort of motivational, kind of feel good chemical. It's not defined specifically like that. But when we feel we're on the right track, our brains secrete dopamine. So when we worry, when we get this vague pain in our chest, it's like, oh, what's that? That's a weird pain. Oh, I must be having a heart attack. Now, as soon as you think you're having a heart attack, your brain squirts a little bit of dopamine because you think, "Oh, there's the answer. I'm on the right track." But then then you've got to deal with the fact that now you've convinced yourself you're having a heart attack.
Which is kind of a catch 22.
And that's exactly the catch 22 is exactly the alarm anxiety cycle. So you have alarm in your system, typically from old unresolved childhood wounds that you may not be aware of. And then that triggers the thoughts of your mind, the worrisome thoughts of your mind. And that worrisome thought of your mind actually keeps triggering the alarm that's in your body. So anxiety is really not one thing. It's two. It's the thoughts of your mind and this old energy of alarm that's stored in your body and they feed on each other. So the way we heal from anxiety is we separate those two things. First we realize what anxiety is. It's alarm in the body and the worries of the mind and they both energize each other in this reinforcing feedback loop I call the alarm anxiety cycle. So, what we have to do to heal is first see the cycle and then start pulling the alarm away from the thoughts. And one of the biggest things that I have for people to help them with their anxiety is see if you can separate the thoughts of your mind from the alarm in your body. Because when you get worried, you're you're not going to find the solution with worry. You're just not going to. So what I prefer people do is go into the sensation of the body, even if it's uncomfortable, and it probably will be uncomfortable, and breathe into it, put your hand over it, see if you can actually feel into that sensation. It's a much more productive use of your intention and energy to go into your body and soothe yourself than it is to stay up in your head and worries, because the worries will never end. But at least if you can start feeling that alarm in your body, you may begin to start metabolizing that alarm. And because the alarm is the underlying cause of anxiety in the first place, you actually start going at the root cause as opposed to just getting caught in your mind, which is a never ending loop that never gets you anywhere.
Um, in terms of, you mentioned the neurochemistry of the brain, you talk about the amygdala and what's
Yeah.
happening there. Can you tell us about what's happening from, I suppose, from a neuroscience perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the amygdala is there's two. It's an almond shaped sort of nucleus on each side of the brain. You have a left and a right. And the amygdala is involved in just about every fear pathway in the human brain. There's other parts of the brain that are actually involved as well. Periaqueductal gray, which is basically back lower in the brainstem, the lowest part of the brain that secretes endorphins and enkephalins, like the brain's natural painkillers. Is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is kind of like the part of the brain that says this is a threat, this is not a threat. So when you get activated, you actually shut off the rational part of your brain, so that worries that appeared completely plausible to you when you were in this activated alarm state, when you're out of that alarm state, look kind of ridiculous. And it just goes to show that it's really the state of your body that dictates the thoughts and dictates how much of those thoughts you believe, because when you get into survival physiology, you shut off the rational brain. And evolutionarily, we didn't need to be close and connected when we were running away from a saber-toothed tiger. So we shut off that connection part of ourselves. And when we shut off the connection part of ourselves, when we're in anxiety and worry, we limit love and connection that we need to actually heal the alarm in the first place. So this is why alarm and anxiety creates such a profound reinforcing feedback loop, both in ourselves and in society as a whole.
Yeah. You talk about the three W's of worrying:
Yep.
warnings, what ifs, and worst case scenarios. Worst case scenarios, kind of a catastrophizing, I think the term is.
Yeah.
That's something that I do. I'm sure there's quite a few listeners. We all imagine the worst possible disaster, and our
Mhm.
mind races away. But what can you tell us about the three W's?
Well, they increase in intensity. So first the brain gives you a little warning like, "Hey, I hope this doesn't happen."
Mm.
And then it's like, "Well, if this happens, what if this happens?" And then the last one is the worst case scenario, which is like, and the reason why the worst case scenario is there is, I believe the reason we worry is because worry drags us up into our heads, up into our thinking minds, when really the problem is this intense feeling of alarm that's down in our body that's probably been there since we were children. So, what worry does is it actually pulls our attention away from that horrible feeling that we had as a child of alarm and keeps us in our head, which on some level saves us from that horrible feeling of alarm that we had as children. Now, what worries have to do is they have to get more and more intense to keep us up in our heads. Because if worries became more benign or whatever, there's the risk that we're going to go back down into that feeling state of alarm again. So, the reason why worries tend to get worse and worse is to keep us in our heads and away from that painful feeling of alarm that's probably been there since we were 4, 5, 7, 12 years old.
Um, Background versus foreground alarm. This is a
Sure.
big theme in anxiety or X.
Yeah, it's basically background alarm is the trauma from your background. And it may not even be your personal background. It could be inherited family trauma. It could be something like when you were born, you had to go into the neonatal ICU for a while. So you're separated from your mother from a very early age. So background alarm is kind of the unresolved traumas of your life that wind up getting stored in your body. Foreground alarm is the immediate reaction. That's kind of like the fight or flight that our system goes into when we realize we might be making a mistake, or someone says you have to do a talk in front of, your business colleagues or whatever. Foreground alarm is that heart beating, fast breathing, kind of sweaty kind of thing. Now everybody gets foreground alarm. But not everybody gets background alarm, because background alarm is coming in the body from old, unresolved, typically childhood wounding. So, for background alarm will trigger foreground alarm. So, if you had, say, a dog bite when you were a child and you see a dog that's similar to the one that bit you walking down the street towards you, your brain, your amygdala will recognize that situation and it will fire this sense of alarm right through your body. And foreground alarm isn't everybody. So there may be a site where you're beside somebody and that big dog is coming down the street. Now you're both feeling a little apprehensive about it because it's a big dog coming down the street, but the one who's been bitten in the past is going to get a much more exacerbated foreground alarm, sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight reaction than the person who hasn't had a bad experience with a dog. But both will have it. So everybody has foreground alarm. It's just basically the fight or flight reaction of the sympathetic nervous system. But background alarm is what we have if we have chronic anxiety, unresolved trauma that never got solved, like abandonment, abuse, loss, neglect, bullying, having to mature too early, and shame. Those are the classic things that cause background alarm to get stored in our body. And if we had a supportive caregiver at the time that we went through those things, we can metabolize those traumas at the time they occurred. But so many of us didn't have parents who were that adept at resolving our trauma. And if you don't have a parent who can resolve the trauma for you, because childhood's traumatic for everybody, that trauma eventually gets stored in your body as background alarm, which feeds the worries of your mind. And that's where I believe that chronic anxiety begins.
In terms of your own healing, you were in your 50s, 54, I think, when it was when you started doing you did LSD and you did MDMA, I think, was it?
Right. Yeah, and ayahuasca as well.
And ayahuasca.
And psilocybin at some point. But it's not like I used to do them all the time. I think I've probably done them like a total of like a handful of times. I did MDMA once, I believe. I did ayahuasca twice. I did LSD once. So it's not like I'm some psychonaut who's like, you got to do all these psychedelics to heal. In fact, I think a lot of what happened to me on ayahuasca was that my anxiety actually got considerably worse for 18 months after the ayahuasca. So I think people are getting this idea that, oh, I'll just do psilocybin or I'll just do ayahuasca or I'll just do some sort of psychoactive drug, ketamine or whatever, and that's going to heal my anxiety. And in some people, it can actually make it worse. So it's not a panacea. I think it does actually open up a different part of our psyche to ourselves, which I think is important. But I think really the healing from just about any mental disorder comes from adult you connecting with child you. I think that's really what it comes down to. Anxiety at its fundamental is a separation of mind from body, which is why exercise and yoga and that sort of stuff helps. And it's a separation of your adult self from your child self. And both of those things, the separation of mind and body and the separation of adult self and child self, cause alarm in your system. So when you resolve the separation of your mind and your body, like doing things like yoga or meditation or chanting or whatever, and you resolve that separation of your adult self, judging your child self or not wanting to be with your child self because the child holds all the pain, then you start resolving the anxiety, the root cause of the anxiety, as opposed to just using therapies like CBT or whatever to try and talk yourself into the fact that you don't have anxiety, or there's strategies you can use to avoid the anxiety, which there are. It's just that you're always going to be avoiding. You're never actually going to heal the underlying root cause. You're just cognitive strategies basically just help you change your reaction to the anxiety. They don't actually heal the anxiety itself.
You referenced another clinician who talks about separation, who says that all anxiety is separation anxiety.
Yeah, that's
Right.
Gordon Neufeld. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the Neufeld Institute in Vancouver, Gordon Neufeld wrote a book with Gabor Mate called Hold On to Your Kids. And Gordon Neufeld really looks into what causes trauma in childhood, what causes overreactions, what causes behavioral issues in childhood. So I've done a lot of work in his institute and looking at childhood, and because I do believe that that's where 90+% of mental illness in adulthood arises from some separation in childhood. So Gordon Neufeld said all anxiety is separation anxiety, which I totally believe in. And then I've added on top of that, and it's mostly separation from yourself, which is going back to separation of your mind and your body and separation of your adult self with your child self.
Um, where are you today with anxiety, Russell? Are you? Say you're cured? You're done. That's it. You beat it.
Cured is a funny word. I mean, anxiety is part of life. I don't think I'll ever be anxiety free. What I have healed in myself is the compulsive urge to keep worrying. You know, I can get myself if I'm stressed, like right now, my mother is not doing very well and she may pass away in the next, 3 to 6 months. Or,
Sorry to hear that.
yeah, she's got those Scottish genes, so she could bounce back again, right? So you never know. So it is one of those things that I think that we just learn how to deal with things better, and then just having the confidence to know that I'm not going to go back into that sort of endless place of doom again. So, cured is a funny word. I think that anxiety is part of life. I think it will always be a part of my life. I think it drives me on some level, but it's just that out of control, runaway train anxiety is gone now. I can recognize that I can be in it for a few minutes and go, oh, okay, I don't like this feeling, but I can actually stay with the feeling. I'm not going to run away from it because running away from the feeling just creates more worry. We run away from the feeling typically into worry and rumination rather than just sitting there and actually allowing that feeling to come through the sadness of, potentially losing my mother, just staying with that feeling rather than this immediate escape into the ruminations of the mind, which is, I believe, what we did as children, because when we're powerless children and there's a situation where you're being abused, abandoned, bullied, neglected, or whatever, there is no escape. There is no escape at that particular point. So now as an adult, you realize, yes, there is. I can actually stay in my body, metabolize that old wound, metabolize that old pain, stay with it even if it hurts. And I have this thing that I write about in the book called Sensation Without Explanation, which is basically allowing the sadness, allowing the alarm, allowing the envy, allowing the negative emotion. Just be there. Just allow it to be there. Put your hand over it. Localize where you feel it in your body. Put your hand over it. Breathe into it. Stay with it. Because if you stay with it, you will metabolize it. But if you, every time you feel it, you go into your head and start to worry, you never actually stick with it long enough to metabolize it and change it in any way.
You feel grateful that you have had it. I mean, it does seem to be you're quite a success. You're successful. You're a clinician. You're a doctor. I would say it might almost have been your superpower in a way.
Yeah, I mean, my regret is that I suffered for so many years. I
Mm.
think that's the thing. Like, am I grateful for it now? Yeah. I mean, I write about this in the book too. The reason why I think I became an anxiety expert was to make sense of the pain that my father went through, to to take his pain and actually put it into the world in a very positive way. So in that respect, yeah, it's a very fulfilling experience for me to do that. There is this sense that anxiety will always be a part of my life. I am on some level grateful for it, for sure, because it's actually pointed me to a much better relationship with myself. Just being able to find that younger version of me and see him, hear him, be open to him, understand him, love him, and defend him. That's really important. But my regret in it is it took me so long to find this because I was kind of stuck in traditional therapies for a long time. Cognitive therapies, you name the therapy, I probably did it. And medications, all that kind of stuff. And really, they're just kind of band-aids. They don't really fix the underlying cause of the problem. So my only, or my big issue with anxiety is that I stayed in it for so long, and I wish that I would have been able to heal it a lot earlier than that. And I think that's my mission, is to get to people in their 20s and 30s, and I, help people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s as well. But get to them early enough to show them that, hey, traditional therapy has the wrong idea of what anxiety is and how to heal it. This is the only thing that really helped me. and my I don't want you to have to suffer with anxiety for 40 years like I did.
When it comes to healing, you do the ABCs, right?
Yep,
So
that's one of them. Yep.
yeah. Um, so can you talk to me about the ABCs?
Yeah, so I try to make it as easy as possible for people because when you're in anxiety and alarm, like I said, your rational brain has been shut off. So, this is one of the reasons why cognitive behavioral therapy leaves you when you need it the most. So, when you are alarmed, you shut off your rational brain. Your rational brain is usually the engine of cognitive therapy. So, you're shutting off the engine of cognitive therapy exactly when you're in survival mode. So the ABCs are basically awareness, like create awareness of how anxiety feels in your body. Create awareness of your frequent flyer worries. Are you a hypochondriac? Is it social anxiety? Like what are you afraid of running out of money? Like what is your typical worry pattern? And be aware of that. And if you start getting caught into it, go, okay, oh, I'm catching myself in my old pattern of worried about illness or worried about money or worried about my kids. Okay, so the next letter is B. So the first one is awareness. Second one is B, body and breath. So you go into your body and your get out of your head. You're not going to find the solution in your head as much as your brain tries to tell you that it can think your way out of a feeling problem, you can't. So A is awareness of your, feeling in your body and the frequent flyer worries that you have. And instead, you just go immediately out of that and into your body and your breath. That's B. So body and breath is B. Find your breath slowly. If you concentrate on your breath, it will naturally become slower and naturally become more relaxing. And then C is basically developing a compassionate connection to the child in you. There's a lot of C's in that one. And then it's like once you regulate yourself in your body, then you can connect with that younger version of yourself. So I have people put a picture of themselves when they were a child up above their bathroom mirror and connect with that child every day and talk to them and bring them into your life. Now, this is easier said than done because a lot of times that child was going through a tremendous amount of angst and pain. So it takes some patience, and for everybody it may not work because if you were say emotionally, physically, sexually abused as a child, it's going to be very difficult for you to visit that child on a regular basis if you have a picture of that child up all the time. So that's when typically I recommend people find like an internal family systems therapist or somatic experiencing therapist or someone who can help them deal with the body based alarm that was created by those initial incidents in the first place. And then once you're used to that, and then you can maybe put a picture of yourself up, you can keep connecting with that younger version of you. That's how you heal. So the ABCs are awareness of your patterns, both emotional and cognitive. B is going into your body and breath, getting out of your head. You're not going to find the peanut butter in a tree. It's not going to be there. You're not going to find the answer. You can't think your way out of a feeling problem. That's B. And then C is create that compassionate connection to yourself today and to the child that's still in you. Those are the three-step process. Now, I do have an online program as well called Your Mind Body Prescription for Permanent Anxiety Healing, which goes deeper into meditations and that kind of thing where you can use to connect with yourself. But the ABCs are really the skeleton, the foundation of this is how you heal. Everything on top of that is practice. You could heal just by using the ABCs. The online program helps you understand a little better from different points of view, but really the healing process is all just this ABC process.
Do you think people are self-medicating for anxiety with
Oh,
alcohol?
absolutely. I think addiction is basically self-medication for anxiety. I rarely see anybody who's addicted to anything who it wasn't preceded by anxiety. So, or depression, but typically anxiety. So, when someone has anxiety and they take a drink or they take a medication or whatever, you're basically conditioning yourself to take medication. And I have nothing against medication. I think medication, we absolutely need medication for many people. You know, I'm not one of these people that says, you can holistically heal everything. I think we do need medication, and it's important that we have it available too. But we also have an ability to adopt a new framework on how to heal from anxiety and hopefully either get off medication or reduce medication, which is kind of like my goal with a lot of people. But I'm not against medication. I think that whatever gets you through the night in a lot of ways, once you start your healing process and you're on the right track, then I think medications start to fall away naturally. I think that's what happens. But we need to sort of titrate our healing because nothing happens quickly. You know, your anxiety probably built in you over the course of 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years. We're not going to heal that in a week. No matter what internet program says, here, I did this program and my anxiety was completely gone in 4 days. Like it just the way that the structures of your brain work just don't work that way. A lot of anxiety and alarm are mediated by structures lower down in your brain, more the unconscious structures, pons, medulla, amygdala, bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis, anterior cingulate cortex, and none of those structures understand language. They all understand feeling. So we have to change the feeling. And that takes a while before the new feeling is the new way of life. And that's why a lot of healing from anxiety, and I tell this to all the people that I work with, is kind of like this 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. Is that, I'll have people that I work with going, I had a really anxious weekend. I was feeling so good up until that. Is my therapy failing? It's like, no, your nervous system is now testing you because you know what to do now. It's testing you to make sure that you use these strategies in the time that you need them the most. So your system will test you and give you some anxiety and alarm just so that you can practice this, so that you can learn a new way of thinking, feeling, and being. It's not a cognitive thing, it's a feeling thing. And feeling things take a while to change. But once you start feeling better, and once you start feeling that, oh, I have some control over this. I don't have to rely on my doctor or my medications or whatever. I can do this for myself. There's a huge shift that happens at that point because so much of anxiety, and this is a whole podcast in and of itself, is this victim mentality we get into when we're younger. And that victim mentality, if you're in a victim mentality, you'll never get an anxiety and alarm. It just neurochemically, it just doesn't allow you to create that confidence in yourself. So that was a bit of a rant, but that's kind of where I'm going.
Well, that's very interesting point you're making there because it requires an adjustment in how you perceive yourself and
Absolutely.
and taking control and agency. If you're a victim, you're giving away power, you're giving away control. So how could you control or hope to gain any control over these anxious feelings
Yeah.
driving you insane?
Yeah, if you look at it, and the little example that I often draw on is, say you're at a party and you see somebody across the way that you find interesting or you'd like to talk to. So there's two ways you can go. One is just, as Mel Robbins says, count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just start walking over to them and talking to them. Now, when you do that, you start secreting uh, your brain's natural morphine from the periaqueductal gray. You start secreting dopamine. So you're on the right track. So your brain will reward you for that.
Action.
Now, here's scenario two.
Mm,
Oh, you know what? They're far too attractive for me. Like they're not going to want to talk to me. They're probably going to hate me if I walk up there. Now,
mm.
what happens then is your hypothalamus starts secreting CRH, which goes to the adrenal medulla, or sort of the adrenal cortex, and creates cortisol and epinephrine. And basically, it gets you into this stressful fight or flight state. And then you tell yourself, yeah, I better not go over there because they're just going to reject me. There's no point. So the confirmation bias that our minds make up with the chemicals that they're working with. So if you're working with dopamine and endogenous opiates, your mind frame will be, I'm going to go do this. It may hurt, but that's okay. But if you go on your heels and you start secreting norepinephrine, and noradrenaline, and cortisol, your brain is going to say, this is dangerous. And then your brain will say, because this is what's going to happen. This horrible situation is going to happen. Both of them are predictions. Both of them we don't know because it's the future. But your brain will support whatever action you take. So if you take the action of a victim, your brain will give you victim chemicals. And if you take the action of a victor, your brain will give you victorious chemicals. And on some level, you get a chance to choose. But if you're a victim, you will automatically default into, oh, this is not going to work out. This isn't going to work for me.
And it's self-perpetuating because it's going to happen
Absolutely.
again and again and again in the same scenario, and you'll have yeah, the anxiety will reemerge again.
And this starts in childhood.
Yeah.
Connor, like this, this victim mentality isn't something that you just adopt when you're 25. Like this is something that gets really ingrained from a very young age. So it's something you really have to be aware of and start moving against. Like a lot of the new book that's coming out in September talks a lot about the victim mentality. And one of the ways, and there's a number of ways, but one of the ways of getting out of victim mentality is getting a little bit angry. Not rage, but get a little bit angry. Because the thing about victim mentality is it demotivates you. It basically just takes your energy, it sucks the energy out of you. And when you get a little angry, the anger kind of brings it up. So it's like the way in the original scenario, it's like, you know what? I'm not going to let myself sit here and be a victim. I'm going to go over and talk to that person. And if they reject me, well, that's just what's going to happen, and then they go do it. And then the more you do that, the more you teach yourself consciously and unconsciously that you have a lot more power than what you've led yourself to believe over the years.
You're building emotional resilience, and
Totally.
success in life at anything requires emotional resilience, the ability to get back up and go and go and go again and again and again, right?
Absolutely.
Um, I wanted to ask you about social social policy. Um, Jonathan Haidt has released a book called The Anxious Generation. Are we building an anxious generation?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that too. I think one of the main reasons is that the world is just more stressful than it ever has been. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, we've never had more food, we've never had less wars." And it's like, no, it's just we're so disconnected from each other in general. And people view loneliness and disconnection as a trauma. And the more we get disconnected, the more we adopt this victim mentality, the more we fall into this place where we are anxious and we are not challenging ourselves. We are not going over to talk to that person anymore because we're afraid of all the negative things that could happen. And that's just a metaphor. The going over to talking to someone, it's just a metaphor for not challenging ourselves. And then we see a lot of the youth going, no, that's a personal affront to me. Like the way if you don't use my pronouns, that's abuse, that's assault, and unless we challenge the human nervous system, it will just default greater and greater and greater into this victim mentality. And then the chemicals will show up as victims. So we get more cortisol, we get more norepinephrine. We don't actually create this ability in ourselves to kind of go, hey, no, I am not actually going to be a victim here. I'm going to move towards something. I'm going to accept another point of view, even if it disagrees with me. Because that's the other thing is that as we get more stressed and as we get more disconnected as a population, we start defaulting into what we think we know. So this is where racism gets going. This is where a lot of things start that we make an emotional, and this is what's happening in the United States right now. They're not really governing anymore. It's just basically how can the Democrats show that the Republicans are idiots, and how can the Republicans show that the Democrats are idiots? It's become this sort of, almost race war between the two political parties, and they're not interested in finding a solution. They're only interested in making the other side look bad. And this creates this huge victim mentality out of all of us. And when we get into that victim mentality, like I said, we're never going to be able to have any antidote or um, opposite emotion than anxiety or depression.
Yeah. Depression is looking at is about the past, anxiety is about the future, right?
In general, I think that's fair enough, but anxiety really has a lot to do about your traumatic past too, right?
Mm.
So anxiety is really taking your traumatic past and projecting it into the future. But as a general rule, that it's a nice little neat statement, and I think that's kind of true. Um, but it's a generalization, and every generalization has its weak points for sure.
There's a line in your book I wanted to raise, an issue I wanted to raise, which you can get your perspective, and because it certainly gave me anxiety reading it.
Sure.
I was a doctor, so I could afford to be a patient.
Mm-hmm.
That's a damning indictment of the healthcare system.
Oh, for sure. I mean, therapy is, I don't know what it is in Ireland. It's probably like, what is it, 100 pounds an hour? I don't know what it is, or
Yeah, but I mean, you can get it on the national system. You can get it. I mean, if you're working, you're going to be covered. In the UK, you can get it on the NHS. I mean,
but you only get like 6 to 8 sessions or something like that,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
which
So it's,
is,
it's something.
well, it is something. And in a way, and this may be a controversial opinion, in a way, it's almost worse
Mm,
because now you've got this person to open up about their emotional, physical, sexual abuse or whatever it is in 6 to 8 sessions. And then they're like, okay, well, thanks for opening up your heart and pulling out the worst parts of your life. See you later, right? Because it takes many, many sessions
mm.
before you start feeling more comfortable, especially if you start using something like somatic therapy, which is less cognitive, which is less verbal. It's a feeling state. And it takes a while before that feeling state starts in. So, this idea that, you'll have 6 to 8 sessions of talking about something and that's going to resolve it, to me is ridiculous. Like it just doesn't work that way. It might work that way if you have a phobia to spiders or, you're not getting along with your workmate, sure. But if you've got old trauma, abuse, loss, neglect, abandonment, bullying, you know, rejection, shame, that stuff isn't going to get metabolized in 6 to 8 sessions.
If we are building and fueling and driving a nation, a Western society that filled with anxiety, Um, what are we going to do about it? What is the policy? Like, how are you collectively, can society? I mean, are we going to ban all the apps? Are we going to ban social media? Where are the answers? Like,
It's too late. The horse is out of the barn as far as that
hmm,
goes. Like people are not going to all of a sudden go back to not being dopamine driven, not being dopamine dependent. There's a couple of great books, The Molecule of More is one, Dopamine Nation is another one, just about how the human brain is wired for novelty. Um, and anything that kind of stimulates it. So the horse is out of the barn as far as social media goes. I think the only way that we're going to be able to kind of pull ourselves out of this tailspin is creating community efforts of connection. It doesn't have to be a lot of connection, but I just think that making people feel that they are a part of something and that they're not separate from everyone else, because that's in if you look at since 1950s and 1960s, where you used to know all your neighbors, you used to have barbecues with them, you'd but we don't have that anymore. We next door neighbors, like, you may not know anything about them, and it's a metaphor for just how separate we are as a society. We gain security from being connected to other people, and the currency of being a human being is dropping. Just we used to give people a lot of, I guess leeway isn't the right word, but just if you're a different race than white or whatever it was, it's just like, well, you're human too. You suffer the way, maybe not the way that I do, but we all have this sort of sense of connection to each other. We're all human beings. Now it's getting to be the us them mentality that's being fostered specifically in the States, and specifically under people like Trump and that kind of stuff. Trump didn't start it, but he basically just threw a bunch of fire on this whole divisive thing, where he calls people names, and it's just, and the reason why people do that is to develop this us them mentality, because in the us mentality you feel a little more secure, but by definition there's a them, and then human currency drops. And if you look at things like OnlyFans and that kind of thing, like, we used to revere females in our society. Now they're highly sexualized. And even the young females are starting to do that to themselves, right? Like they're wearing provocative clothes at like 12 or 13 years old. It just, the whole society is really getting wrapped up in this idea of the individual, the pronouns too. And I don't, if you want me to call you a certain way, I'll absolutely do that. But there's certain rules that we have in society, in civilization. If I just decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to tell all my followers not to stop at red lights anymore because red lights are a sign of the patriarchy. They slow me down. They prevent me from getting across town where I needed to go. I'm suggesting to you that you just ignore red lights and just drive right through them. We need rules and we need certain constructs to survive as a civilization. And what we are doing is systematically dismantling those constructs. And when we do that, we lose human currency and we lose the idea that we are all connected. And that's a very dangerous place. So the solution with all that negative is to, communities, start becoming more connected to each other. I don't know how we're going to specifically do that, but just creating the intention that we are going to be more connected. Starting men's groups, I think, men's groups are starting to pop up all over the world now. I mean, I think that's a start. But it's just developing the sense of connection with each other, and not that the other side or other people or whatever have it better than us, or they should be punished because they're this way or that way or they're not like us. This is what's dismantling the the constructs that society runs on.
Identity and othering people, like, well, like what you said, is very, very, can be very, very destructive. I wanted to ask you about, we kind of touched on it, gender and
Mhm.
anxiety. Are you finding any differences in how men and women cope?
It's interesting. Like Shelley Taylor does some work. She's a PhD that does some work with women, and she has this idea that the stress response in women is different than the stress response in men, which I kind of follow as well. And
Mm.
that women are much more likely to secrete oxytocin, kind of like the so-called love hormone, which is it's a very highly oversimplified term, than men are. So women tend to, in the stress response, tend to get into this tend and befriend thing, whereas men are much more likely to go to this fight or flight kind of thing. So this may be a reason why, women stay in abusive relationships, because, their stress response gets fired up and their oxytocin gets fired up. So they don't want to separate from this person. So people will say, well, why didn't you just leave them? Why didn't you just leave them? Well, if you've got a bunch of oxytocin, a bunch of the connection hormone running around in your brain when you're stressed, you're going to look for ways that you can stay in it without having to leave. Now, that's a theory. I think it has some solid weight behind it, but it is one of those things where I think it's just a matter of how do we connect within ourselves for sure, and I think that's a big part of it. And how do we connect with other people? How do we allow other people to just, live and let live? And the gender stuff, and I do see younger people with gender confusion and anxiety, because the thing about anxiety is it doesn't have a specific answer. So, if you're 14 and you think, well, what if I'm gay? And then the confirmation bias kicks in and you start looking at people of your own sex going, yeah, maybe I'm attracted to them. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I am. um, because it doesn't have an absolute yes, you are, or no, you're not. That's brilliant fodder for anxiety because you can't resolve it. So whenever you get into this angst situation, and there's a lot of angst in being a teenager, you start wondering, well, maybe this angst is because I'm worried that I'm gay. And I think that this is catching on like a contagion as well. So it is one of those things that, we are these rational creatures, and but I think we believe we're a lot more rational than what we truly are. I believe that we're emotional beings that are guided a bit by our rationality rather than rational beings that are guided by our emotions.
Yeah, I think Daniel Kahneman did a lot of great work. Daniel
Yeah,
Goleman did it on this stuff. He passed away recently. But I think I'll paraphrase him by saying one of the ideas that we make emotional decisions and come back later and justify with logic,
totally.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you make a very interesting point about teenagers. I mean, they would be, and in aging, right? So at that particular age, they would be vulnerable to anxiety,
Hmm.
vulnerable to anxious feelings. Um, as we grow older, do you think anxiety dissipates naturally, organically, or can it grow, or
I think
what's
on
your?
some level it does. And I think that if you become more comfortable with yourself and you become more connected to yourself, yes, it does. But
Mm.
if you become more disconnected from yourself, it gets worse. So loneliness gets worse. You lose more as you get older. You lose friends. You lose your ability. Like my mother, like 10 years ago, she couldn't drive anymore. You know, there is these losses that we go through as adults. I think we don't have the same kind of fight or flight fire that we would have when we were younger. So in that respect, I think anxiety feels a little less intense, but there is this sort of existential angst about death, about losing parents, losing your spouse, you know, when you get to be in your 60s and stuff. Like there's stuff that happens. And anxiety is one of those things that whatever the template you have formed for the previous 60 years is probably going to stay with you. Does it ease a bit in some people? Yeah. Does it get worse? Yeah. In some people it does. So I don't think there's a way of sort of taking a snapshot of, 160-year-olds and going, you've been anxious in the past, so your anxiety is going to get better and yours is going to get worse. I think it's really individual. It depends on, you know, how how much trauma you've had in your life and how much you've overcome. And I think what I would end that with is if you've had a fair amount of trauma in your life and you've got to be 50 or 60 and you start looking back and you go, oh, that divorce was horrible. That was terrible, but I made it through. I think there is that sense of resilience that you kind of get from that. Whereas young people don't, when they look at things and they look at major things like death of a parent or maybe even a divorce at an early marriage, it's harder for them because they don't have this track record. So it's a really hard question to answer, Connor.
Dr. Kennedy, where can people find you?
Probably Instagram is usually the best way to find me. I mean, everything is under the Anxiety MD, not the Anxiety Doctor, but the Anxiety MD. So my Instagram, my website. I have a book on Amazon called Anxiety RX. I have a podcast called Anxiety RX. I have a online program called Your Mind Body Prescription for Permanent Anxiety Healing, and I shorten that up to MBRX, which you can Google as far as that kind of stuff goes. And yeah, it's my mission to make sure that people don't suffer with anxiety and waste 40 years of their life like I did. And it's not really a waste because now I'm turning into something that's very positive and very helpful and that kind of thing. But yeah, if I had my big regret is that I wasted so long before I found this out, before I found this different way of looking at anxiety, understanding it and treating it. That's my regret, and that's what I want to make sure other people don't have to go through.
You did say in the book, I had an anxiety disorder so severe I considered suicide, which is
Oh
about as
yeah.
severe as
Oh
it
yeah.
gets.
Oh yeah.
I suspect you're not alone. Um, what does the future hold for you? Touched on it there. There's a new book coming out, right? Are you working on it, or do you have
Yeah,
it to listen?
it's actually the second edition of the first book. So the first book was self-published called Anxiety RX, and it's sold almost 90,000 copies now as a self-published book, which is pretty much unheard of. So the big publishers, Penguin Random House in the UK and Macmillan in the States, said, "Would you be willing to do a second edition of that book?" And I said, "Absolutely." So we started that process back in October, and today I took I'm at the very last stages. I have to have the book into the publisher by the 19th of April. And
Oh,
today I'm
damn.
sort of, yeah, well, I'm almost done. Like I've gone through the whole thing and now I'm just polishing. Now I'm just polishing. So there's three sections to it and I'm in the middle of polishing the second section, and then by tomorrow I should finish polishing it all. So the timing is actually pretty good. And it's nice to be able to just kind of take a break from editing, Connor, and just speak and talk because it's been so insular over the last 10 days, just editing every single day. So it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Be fantastic to talk with you too. Hopefully, a lot of people will buy your book. I remember watching a video of you about a year ago. It had sold 45,000 copies at that stage.
Mm,
I thought, wow, that's amazing. But 90 is incredible.
yeah, yeah. And I have
Um,
to take it off the market in June, the original version, because the contract for the new edition, they don't want one being out at the same time as the other. So on June the 17th, I have to take out the original version and then have pre-sales for the new version. The new version is actually much better. The original version is great, and I think at the time when I wrote it, I think I really had some idea of my theories and that kind of thing. And I think I gave people the real skeleton of what they needed to heal. But this second edition is the best work I've ever done. I think it's going to change the narrative around how anxiety is looked at and treated worldwide.
Great. Dr. Kenny, I look forward to buying it when it comes out. And thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Thank you. It was a
Thank you, Connor.
privilege and pleasure talking to you.